In the early and middle stages of a career, hard work is often the most reliable way to progress. People who take on more tasks, stay longer, solve more difficult problems, they tend to receive more responsibilities, stronger evaluations, and more opportunities. This pattern is especially common in tech organizations where output can be measured through shipped features, resolved incidents, delivered milestones, satisfied stakeholders. And during this phase, it's reasonable to believe that more effort leads to more progress because the relationship between what a person does and what the organization receives is clear and direct. Many leaders eventually reach a point where increasing effort stops producing the same momentum. They may feel as though they're running faster while gaining less ground. They may receive positive feedback while also sensing that they're not being considered for broader scope. They may find that being busy, responsive, reliable no longer feels like a differentiator. This experience is confusing because the habits that built a successful career still feel like the correct habits. When progress slows, the natural response is often to work even harder because that response has worked in the past. Now, my purpose here is to explain why working harder stops being the most effective strategy for advancement at senior levels. The central argument is that effort remains necessary, but it stops being the primary currency of advancement. At higher levels of leadership, organizations value leverage more than visible effort. Leverage refers to impact that scales beyond a leader's direct involvement. Leaders who continue to advance are those who create conditions in which many people can make good decisions, coordinate effectively, and produce consistent results without constant supervision. In other words, senior roles reward leaders who multiply organizational capability rather than leaders who personally carry the org through effort alone. So why does effort work earlier in a career? Well, working harder produces results earlier in a career because the scope of responsibility is usually clear. The feedback loops are short, outcomes are easy to attribute to an individual. When someone is an individual contributor, a significant portion of their value comes from what they personally produce. For example, a software engineer writes code, fixes defects, reviews changes, supports releases. A designer, on the other hand, creates assets, improves user experience, strengthens the product's overall usability. A project manager builds plans, tracks progress, and resolves dependency issues. In each case, effort typically results in visible output, and visible output is strongly rewarded. Now, organizations reinforce this relationship because they need reliable execution. Early in a person's development, the most useful question a manager can ask is whether the person delivers on commitments. People who consistently deliver become trusted. They are given important work because they have proven that they can handle it. Now, this trust often leads to more responsibility, more exposure, and eventually promotion. It's therefore rational for ambitious professionals to believe that doing more, caring more, being more responsive will translate into advancement. Now, effort also works earlier because it accelerates learning. The more problems someone solves, the more patterns they recognize. The more projects they support, the more they understand how teams coordinate and where organizations tend to break down. The more they communicate with stakeholders, the better they become at navigating uncertainty and aligning expectations. Early career effort builds competence, and competence is highly rewarded. In short, effort is visible, it produces tangible results, and it accelerates growth. And for these reasons, effort becomes a trusted strategy for progress. The challenge emerges when leaders reach a level where the nature of their work changes, but their operating habits do not change with it. Senior roles are defined less by personal output and more by the ability to create outcomes through other people. A senior leader may own a product area, or an engineering organization, or a portfolio of initiatives, or the performance of multiple teams. The work is no longer a set of tasks that can be completed through personal effort alone. It becomes a system of priorities, trade-offs, resource constraints, decision-making patterns, organizational behavior. At this stage, effort becomes less visible for several reasons. First, senior leaders are expected to be busy, so visible busyness does not stand out. In many organizations, people assume that senior leaders have full calendars and heavy responsibility. Second, senior work often occurs through conversations, decisions, and judgment calls that are difficult to measure. Third, the outcomes that matter are produced by many people across time, which makes it harder to attribute success to a single leader's effort. When an organization ships a major release, the visible work belongs to dozens or hundreds of contributors, and senior leaders are judged not by the volume of their activity, but by the quality of the environment that made the delivery possible. This is the point where leaders often experience a plateau. They may respond by increasing effort even further. They attend more meetings, they answer more messages, they insert themselves into more decisions, and they may believe that if they can stay on top of everything, they will regain momentum and demonstrate readiness. Unfortunately, this strategy often creates the opposite effect. It creates dependency on the leader and reduces the organization's ability to operate independently. Over time, the leader becomes a bottleneck. The organization moves slower because it waits for the leader's involvement. The leader feels essential, but the organization becomes less scalable, and the leader's readiness for greater scope becomes less obvious. At senior levels, organizations reward leverage because leverage is the only sustainable way to scale. A leader's time and attention are limited. If the organization depends on a senior leader to personally resolve most problems, the organization will not scale effectively. The leader will be overwhelmed, and teams will slow down while waiting for guidance. For this reason, leadership evaluation shifts, even if it is never stated explicitly. The question becomes less about how much does this person do, and more about what happens because of how this person operates. Leverage can be defined as the ability to produce a larger effect with the same amount of direct involvement. In leadership terms, leverage is the capacity to create results through structures, systems, and guidance that enable many people to act effectively. A leveraged leader makes it easier for others to do the right work, make good decisions, and address problems early. This does not mean the leader is absent. It means the leader's influence is embedded in the way the organization functions. When the leader is leveraged, the organization performs better, not because the leader is everywhere, but because the leader has shaped how work flows and how decisions are made. Leverage aligns with how senior leaders think about risk. In complex organizations, risk does not come only from missed deadlines or technical defects. Risk comes from unclear priorities, slow decisions, misaligned incentives, repeated escalations, and problems that surface too late to address calmly. Leaders who reduce these sources of risk increase the organization's resilience. They create stability that is more valuable than heroic problem solving. When leadership teams discuss who's ready for broader scope, they're often trying to determine whether the person will reduce organizational risk by creating capability, or whether the person will increase risk by becoming a single point of dependency. At senior levels, working harder can become a liability because it can communicate the wrong signals. If a leader appears to be in every meeting, the organization may conclude that the work requires constant supervision. If a leader is always fixing problems personally, the organization may conclude that the teams are not developing capability. If a leader is deeply involved in every decision, the organization may conclude that the decision-making depends on that leader's presence. These signals reduce confidence that the organization will function well if the leader's scope expands. This creates a paradox. The leader feels indispensable because they're constantly needed. The organization may also feel the leader is indispensable, but not in a way that supports promotion. If the leader is the person who maintains stability, then promoting the leader may create instability. The leader becomes critical infrastructure. The organization values them, but it also becomes reluctant to move them into a role where they will no longer be available to perform the stabilizing work that they currently provide. As a result, the leader can be praised, rewarded, and relied upon while still being quietly overlooked for advancement. This paradox is especially common in technology organizations because complex delivery work often produces crises. Leaders who repeatedly rescue projects or respond to urgent incidents can build a reputation for reliability under pressure. That reputation is valuable, but it can also become a label. People begin to associate the leader with fixing problems rather than shaping direction. Over time, the leader is given the hardest operational situations, which keeps them busy and visible, but it does not necessarily position them as someone who should be trusted with larger strategic scope. The leader becomes known as the person who carries weight rather than the person who changes how weight is carried. Leverage is visible in the behavior of the organization, not merely in the leader's personal workload. One sign of leverage is that decisions are made efficiently without constant escalation. Another sign is that teams understand the priorities and can explain how their work supports those priorities. A leveraged leader creates clarity so that people spend less time debating what matters and more time delivering meaningful outcomes. The leader also establishes boundaries so that the organization does not attempt to do everything at once and then collapse under the cost of overcommitment. Leverage also appears in how problems surface. In unhealthy organizations, problems surface late, often when deadlines are near or when stakeholders are surprised. Late surfacing creates urgency, and urgency encourages reactive leadership. Now, in healthier organizations, issues surface earlier, when there's still time to adjust. A leveraged leader creates an environment where early truth-telling is safe and expected. They encourage people to raise concerns before the situation becomes urgent. They respond to risk with calm attention rather than blame, which helps the organization develop maturity and reduces the need for crisis management. Another sign of leverage is that the organization continues to function well when the leader is not present. Now, this does not mean the leader is unnecessary. It means the leader is not a bottleneck. If a leader takes time away and everything collapses, that leader has not created leverage. If the organization continues to make progress and the leader returns to clear information and stable operations, then the leader has created an environment that can carry weight without constant supervision. In most cases, this is a stronger indicator of senior readiness than any demonstration of personal heroics. Leverage is often harder than effort, especially at first, because it requires restraint. It asks leaders to resist the immediate satisfaction of solving problems personally. It requires them to invest time in shaping how problems are solved, even when solving the problem directly would be faster in the short term. This trade-off can feel risky and uncomfortable, particularly for leaders who have built their identity on reliability and competence. When a leader stops stepping in, there may be a period when teams struggle before they improve, and the leader must tolerate that learning curve without reverting to old habits. Leverage is also harder because it can make the leader's work less visible. A leader who personally resolves an incident creates a clear story of contribution. A leader who reduces the frequency of incidents through better structure creates a quieter success. Quiet success is valuable, but it is less dramatic, and is sometimes less celebrated. This is one reason why some leaders overinvest in visible effort. They want proof that they are contributing. At senior levels, however, the most valuable contribution often looks like fewer fires, fewer escalations, clearer priorities, and better decision-making. These outcomes are real, but they do not always generate applause, because they often prevent problems rather than solve them in public view. In addition, leverage requires judgment. Leaders must choose where to apply attention and where not to apply it. They must decide which problems require direct involvement and which problems should be solved by teams. They must balance speed with learning and create structures that are simple enough to follow, but strong enough to hold under pressure. These decisions are not easy, and they are not always popular. Nevertheless, they are necessary for scaling. A leader who tries to be involved in everything is often a leader who has not yet learned how to prioritize attention in a way that produces leverage. Although organizations rarely state it explicitly, senior leaders tend to reward certain patterns. They reward leaders who handle ambiguity without spreading confusion. They reward leaders who can make trade-offs and stand behind them. They reward leaders who surface risk early and propose clear options instead of hiding problems until the last moment. They reward leaders whose teams operate with confidence and alignment. And most importantly, they reward leaders who reduce dependency on themselves. Now, this does not mean senior leaders want leaders who are distant or disengaged. It means they want leaders who build capability rather than dependence. When a leader is ready for expanded scope, the organization becomes more effective because of that leader's operating model. The leader does not need to be in every conversation because they've clarified priorities and shaped decision logic. The leader does not need to make every decision because they've established ownership and boundaries. The leader does not need to chase every problem because they've created norms that surface problems early and address them consistently. These are the signals that create confidence. When leadership teams discuss promotions or expanded roles, they often ask whether the person can be trusted to operate at a higher level without creating chaos. They ask whether the person can build capability across the organization. They ask whether the person can keep priorities clear and maintain focus under pressure. These are leverage questions, not effort questions. A leader who demonstrates leverage makes it easier for others to imagine that leader holding a broader portfolio, because the leader has already shown an ability to scale impact beyond personal involvement. The shift from effort to leverage does not require a leader to care less. It requires a leader to care differently. It requires the leader to treat time and attention as scarce resources and invest them in high-impact activities. This often begins by reducing unnecessary involvement. Leaders must identify where they have become the default decision maker and redesign those decision paths so that the organization can move without them. They must also identify where they are providing clarity personally and then build clarity into the structures and expectations that guide the team's daily work. Leverage also requires leaders to view their role as the designer of systems. These systems can be formal, such as meeting structures, decision rights, planning routines, and review cadences, but they can also be informal, such as norms for raising issues, standards for making trade-offs, and expectations for accountability. When leaders design these systems well, the organization can carry more complexity without collapsing into confusion. When leaders do not design these systems, the organization relies on personality and personal heroics, which is not sustainable at scale. Finally, leverage requires leaders to communicate in a way that demonstrates judgment. At senior levels, credibility matters. Leaders need to frame progress, risk, and trade-offs in a way that shows they understand the larger context. They must communicate clearly, calmly, and consistently. They must show that they are guiding the organization through uncertainty, not merely reacting to it. This is not about political performance. This is about making senior leadership work visible in the form executives value, which is typically clear thinking, sound judgment, and reliable decision-making under pressure. In conclusion, working harder stops working at senior levels because the organization's needs change. Early in a career, personal effort produces visible output, and visible output is often the basis for advancement. At senior levels, though, the organization depends on leaders to create outcomes through other people and to scale capability rather than personal contribution. Effort remains necessary, of course, but it becomes assumed. Leverage becomes the differentiating currency. Leverage is demonstrated through an organization that moves without constant intervention. It makes decisions without repeated escalation. It maintains clarity under pressure, and it surfaces problems early enough to address them calmly. Leaders who build leverage signal readiness for expanded scope because they reduce risk rather than concentrate it. They create systems and norms that multiply the effectiveness of others. They replace heroic effort with sustainable capability. For leaders who want to advance, the lesson is not to stop working hard. The lesson is to stop relying on effort as the primary strategy for progression. Advancement at senior levels follows a different logic. It follows leaders who create leverage, because leverage is what allows organizations to scale. Now, if you're ready to advance or you'd like to deepen your leadership bench, I'd love to talk to you. Book a free strategy call and let's chat about how I can help.